panellists here. It's very exciting getting to meet everybody just before. So just to quickly introduce myself. So I'm Louise Jones. I'm the new MP for North East Derbyshire. And in my previous life, I worked in a tech startup, which did develop some AI tools of our own. And so it's fantastic to be able to use some of that expertise to chair this discussion today. As we're all aware, growth is the number one mission of this Labour government. So it's great that we're now going to discuss how AI, which is a fantastic, very exciting family of technologies, which is just gathering pace the more and more we start to research and develop it. So it'll be fantastic, I think, to just hear a spectrum of opinions on it from both from our political colleagues and for those working in industry. So without further ado, I'm going to hand over to Chris here from Meta, who's just going to sort of set out the scene, set the stall. I'm sure we're all very familiar with Meta, the home of Facebook, and indeed the AI tools that Meta is developing, not least Llama, the new model, which I believe is open source code. Am I right in saying so? Yes. So a really critical tool for many businesses that are using it. So without further ado, Chris.
Fantastic. Thank you very much. Can you hear me okay? Yeah, good. Really good to be here. Really pleased to support SME4Labour at conference and talk to all of you a little bit about technology, AI, startups, and how we think all of that can move forward and, as you say, serve the mission for achieving growth and unlocking prosperity. So as we're just talking, there have been a lot of AI events at this conference, it feels like. And I think, lots of policymakers that I talk to can legitimately sometimes say this is all, tremendous amount of noise around this, but, so what for the businesses that I care about and the people in my constituency? And the way that I look at it is that AI is this important transformational foundational technology, just like electricity and telecommunications and transportation before it. There is a real benefit in there, and it can be a real win-win-win for the tech companies, for businesses, and for government, but you've got to get the approach to it right. And we think openness is a really important part of that. So for Meta, we have been on the cutting edge of technology and R&D for 2 decades. We've had this technology powering our apps for longer than people called it AI, right? We called it ranking and machine learning and other things, but now we call it AI. And we really believe that as people who build this technology, that it's really important that everybody, not just some people, but everybody should have access to it and everybody should be able to benefit from it. So the AI models that we're building, and you mentioned Llama, which is our large language model, we release those openly. So they are free for anybody to download and use and remix and adjust as they see fit. And alongside that, we provide a whole set of tools to make sure that you can do that effectively in your organization and guides so you can think about doing it well and effectively and responsibly. I think this is super exciting, right? So for startups who are going to do something really innovative and experimental on top of the models that we release, that's fantastic. And for researchers and academics and others to be able to investigate how they work. For government to take this on and think about how you can use it in the public sector, where open source gives you a lot of control around the data that you use and the terms on which you deploy. Huge opportunities. But also, I think I've heard several people at conference, including some people on the panel and the Secretary of State as well, talk about the importance of technology diffusion and how do you make sure that you get this technology out where it's going to benefit regular businesses, maybe who haven't got the full technical skills. And I think, I'm sure we'll talk about skills on the panel today. I also think the companies have a big role to play here. So one of the things that we do is make the technology accessible for small businesses and entrepreneurs. Lots of small businesses rely on ads on Facebook and Instagram in order to reach customers. Lots of businesses only exist because those Facebook ads made it possible. And with AI, we can make that advertising platform more effective so that as a small business, the money that you spend can more effectively reach customers. We're building technology so that it becomes easier for people to interact more seamlessly, including chatbots in our messaging apps and in our smart glasses. And I've got some of those with me if anyone wants to have a look later on. But it's really exciting that we're making this technology more accessible to people. And I think in time you'll see, for example, businesses having the ability to build AI agents that can talk to customers on their behalf free up time in the business to focus on other things, hopefully increase sales and productivity, really contribute to small businesses as a really engine for growth. So a lot of potential in there. Some things that I think need to happen around this, make sure that as we think about the policy environment for AI, that we make sure we have enough space for innovation and experimentation. You need some rules of the road, but you don't want to shut down the ability for people to experiment with this technology. I think really hard about the role of open source and open data in this arena, particularly for government. To have the ability to work in this way, pull in innovation from different parts of the community, share that back, I think is really, really powerful. And make sure that everybody, like through schools, through universities, through small businesses and entrepreneurship, people have the skills and the confidence to adopt this technology in the things they do, make their businesses better, go about creating the jobs and wealth that the country needs. So I'll leave it there. Really interested to see what the panel has to say.
Brilliant, thank you very much. So I'm going to first come to one of my new colleagues, Kanishka, and it'd be really interesting to hear from your perspective the role that you believe AI and small businesses will play in contributing to growth, and how you see this benefiting your constituents.
Thank you, Louise. And can I just preface with the logistical point that because I'm going to leave early, I hate having the entitlement of speaking to you and not hearing back. So I'll be back in an hour. So if there are questions for me specifically, I'd love to answer them at the reception later. Great question. And let me say one general thing about AI and then two specific things about the open source conversation as well. The general thing about AI is that, and some of the folks in this room, Gordon in particular, has heard this because I've been saying this on multiple panels. Look, there are two sets of conversations on AI. There's a series of conversations we have about pushing the frontier ahead, and the UK being front and centre in the global frontier as well, in being the home of foundation model development and adoption. There's a second set of conversations which are all about, hey, how do you do diffusion? How do you get companies and people to adopt it elsewhere? And surely that is the primary driver of growth. My belief is that the frontier and the diffusion questions are actually best answered when they're answered together and when we see the connections between them. If you think about one of the best ways in which you get people to adopt technologies that are new and novel in terms of how they're currently working, it is through creating a really dynamic application ecosystem. So that there are a bunch of people developing products that mean that they're embedding software and AI in the workflows that you already have, so that we don't have to change our lives radically. Businesses don't have to change their processes radically in order to adopt all the benefits of AI. So the thing I'm most excited about is the day that the hairdressers in Barry Island and the Vale of Glamorgan are adopting AI to try and understand how to do performance marketing and how to optimize for their financing as well, because it has been embedded in the most efficient and effective way for their businesses, rather than government trying to necessarily push adoption through cruder ways. And I think if we are able to do that, developing the frontier is going to be the heart of pushing diffusion as well. The two specific things on the open source debate. Look, one aspect of it is the centrality, is, in my mind, of state capacity, of the quality of our public service situation. And the reason I say that is because I don't know what the right answer is, being honest, on the extent to which open source or closed source is the right answer for foundation model development. Whether or not we think open source is desirable is a tough question. Is it the right balance between protecting against material catastrophic risks if it's in the hands of people who have looked at open source models and are going to do something bad in terms of bioweapons or whatever else it might be? Is it instead, actually, would licensing or regulating it in a material way be the most anti-competitive thing and therefore not desirable? The desirability question is tough to answer. But the feasibility question is also very tough to answer. Even if you thought it was desirable, are model scale, company size, computational usage scale, are these good proxies for us to be regulating and licensing or not? Tough to answer questions. And in the absence of me being able to answer them, I want Britain to have the best public servants and the best state capacity to be able to understand the latest state of play in terms of the actual risk embedded in current foundation models, to be able to answer that question. And so I often feel like policy is downstream of tech. Not understanding where technology and the product is means you're not going to be doing policy and regulation well. And if that's the case, and you believe me on that particular front, I hope you will also believe me that investing in state capacity is going to be the central way in which we navigate our way through this question well. The second and final thing I'll say on open source specifically is I also hope the move towards openness results in a move towards openness and honesty on the fundamental drivers of distributional impacts, fairness in the use of AI. I'm not either optimistic or pessimistic as a starting point. There are some people who think AI can turbocharge inequality in its application. To me, I think back, Ziad Obermeyer at Berkeley has done some great work looking at how arthritis of the knee has been diagnosed, especially amongst ethnic minority populations in the United States, very unfairly, and it was the use of machine learning systems that pointed out that folks who are from the African American community didn't get diagnosed properly, denied surgery, and pushed onto opioids at a far higher rate. Without the use of AI, we wouldn't track those things. And so to be able to understand and deploy AI, being open about the training data that you're using in developing models, and being able to target where we're applying AI to answer not just the question of growth, but the question of fairness alongside it is a really exciting prospect from my point of view. So thank you for this conversation. I'm really excited to catch up afterwards as well.
Brilliant, thank you very much. And I couldn't agree more with your point about certain aspects of AI no doubt will be transformative, but also there is that quiet evolution that AI tools can enable, which makes it useful and relevant to a hairdresser in Barry Island, for example. So yeah, very good point. I'd like to come to you now, Camilla, actually. I'm just interested in your views on the role that open source is going to play in AI and how that does feed into this growth mission.
Right, so not a lot then. Hello, everyone. My name is... Can you hear me okay? Yes. My name's Camilla, and I'm Policy Director at StartUp Coalition. And so just to give you who, what, where we are in 2 sentences. We were founded by a group of startups in order to act for startups in 2010 with the idea that if startups aren't at the policymakers' table, then they're going to very quickly be on their menu. And the other sort of foundational idea we were created with was the idea to try and solve almost Kissinger's Europe problem, but for startups, which is essentially if government wants to talk to startups, who are they going to call? So we try and represent all startups in the UK. And because of that, as I'm sure you can guess, we are all over AI. But up until now, we have not been enough, I think, over sort of the role of open source AI within competition and innovation. And that's something I'm looking now that the election has happened to rectify. And that is in part because I was talking to so many startups in robotics and defense, where open source AI is a lot more normalized and it's not more widespread use, partly because trust and safety is so critical to those 2 sectors. And I'm looking forward to discussing this with everyone, and I know that we want to sort of get everyone's sort of early stakes in this conversation. So I think I'll just say 2 sort of observations. The first is that so far in the UK, we are across lots of different areas of the AI conversation in a very well-developed way, I think, but not when it comes to open source. So even agreeing foundational definitions of what open source AI is, I don't think we've really got there in the UK just yet. So, I'm hoping this panel is the start. But I'm looking forward to that being a more normalized element of our conversation about AI. So far, I think it's just been dominated by what is generative AI and how can we use it. And the second thing I wanted to sort of start off by saying is, I think when I talk to a lot of policymakers at the moment, there is not necessarily a vision for what good in AI looks like for the UK yet. So it's sort of it's very much agreed that AI is probably on balance good, but not necessarily where do we sit within it. And I think for some policymakers that looks like a sort of UK mistrial. And maybe we will get that, but I think for a lot of the UK's soft power and a lot of its value creation, it's going to come from niche models, and it's going to come from applications built on top of foundational models. And that's why open source AI is going to be so critical, because for so much of this, it comes down, I think, to a conversation of who's controlling the AI stack. And so a lot of the work that we're doing at the moment is looking at, for example, what can we learn from how startups have been treated on app stores and the rules around that, and whether we can sort of apply that and think about that for AI. So I'm looking forward to talking about this, but that's my sort of opening where I'm coming from with OpenAI.
Thank you very much. I think that's a great phrase. If you're not at the table, you're on the menu. I'm going to have to steal that one. It's very good. I'm going to turn to you now, Ashley. Just very interested to get your viewpoint from the startups that you work with. What are the challenges and opportunities for AI at the moment, but also interested in how much of a difference things like open source data being released for Llama is making a difference to the startups that you work with.
Brilliant, thank you. So just for a little bit of context, my name's Ashley Ainsley and I run an organisation called Colour in Tech, and we work to try and support people from ethnic minority backgrounds in particular to be successful in the tech industry. So in specifically in this instance, we work with a number of startups, a couple are actually in the room, to support their journey ultimately in building on some of the foundational models that we're hearing about and actually thinking about how they are going to scale and grow their businesses. So I come at it from a perspective of, passing on their views, but also as an SME organisation ourselves and actually how we are thinking also about using it and adopting and some of the challenges that we have. I think on the open source discussion, the general consensus is that it's quite helpful. One of the big challenges that if you talk to any startup, especially when they're really at that idea stage, that pre-seed stage of funding, money is a challenge. And ultimately, when you have a lot of the closed systems, the ability to unlock enough financing to actually have the compute power and be able to actually build and develop, I suppose, software on top of some of these models, one of the limiting factors of that is just pure capital. And especially when we're thinking about the distribution of things like venture capital across the startup ecosystem, we know that that doesn't go to particular communities in the way that it potentially should do. And as a result, we're just locking out opportunity for a whole load of creators and innovators who just don't have access, one, because of the financial means, and two, because of the distribution of those finances as well. And open source is actually seen as a way to circumvent that somewhat. Not having to necessarily pay expensive API fees up into certain levels is really actually helpful in closing some of those barriers, and that's something that we've heard. So actually there's a lot of enthusiasm and excitement. I think one of the challenges around kind of open source in particular, and actually something that's very particular in the UK ecosystem, is actually around skills. And it's great to say, fantastic, the technology is there, anyone can use it and play with it, but you've got to be able to access that. And I think that's something that we still have challenges in within the startup community. And I think there's an education piece as well. I don't think it's just about like, here it is, because what we typically see is the same sort of people end up building and developing on that. But if we are really thinking about how we're going to, spread the benefits, the use cases, and actually think about unlocking the true potential of some of this, I suppose, artificial intelligence, then we really need to be thinking about, is it actually accessible, not just from a cost perspective, but actually are people able to use it and actually build from that? And that's where I think some joined up thinking is really important. And it can't just be seen as kind of like, okay, here it is, let them eat cake. Like, it's got to be a bit more than that. It's actually got to be a situation of like, how do we support businesses to also use some of the technology that's out there? So I think SMEs are quite excited about the potential for open source because and I think we've got parallels to effectively when cloud computing started to happen. We saw that actually finance and the ability to do some of the things on cloud computing went to a few particular players who were able to grow and scale and create a lot of economic value, but in very concentrated forms. And I think if we think about AI as a democratizing factor, then we need to make sure that we're thinking about how it's accessible, and open source is one way to do that, but it's not the only thing that needs to happen as part of that journey.
No, I think that's a really good parallel to draw out between cloud computing and open source. Yeah, I think that's a really good one. Gordon, just come to you. So, we've heard a bit about the challenges and opportunities and how AI can contribute to growth. But how do we make sure that growth is meaningful for your constituents?
Thank you very much, and it's great to be back here at the SME for Labour Tent talking about technology again. I was reflecting, I was just talking to some of the other panellists before. There were 53 AI-related events at Labour Party conference this year, and I thought that was an incredible stat. I got the sense of it looking through the conference Fringe book on Saturday night. If you compare that to last year, I suspect there were maybe 5 or 6, and maybe the year before there were 0. So just you can maybe track AI's rise through Labour Fringe events, which would be an interesting index. I think there's a few different things I want to say and just reflect on some of the other panelists' contributions. Technology ultimately is a tool, and it will accelerate or it will depress human instincts, right? And so if you have a society which has racism in it, which we do, then you are going to accentuate that in some ways with AI, and you see that in some models. It wasn't Meta's, was it Google's model? There was a model where it was, it was saying some pretty horrendous stuff. Not because it was kind of, innately created to do that, but because it was taking in information from the internet, which is full of often quite horrendous stuff. And so I think you've always, as a policymaker, got to be conscious that you can attribute sort of malice, or you can attribute factors to technologies, but ultimately they're only expressing what is in your society in the first place. On the topic of open sourcing, AI is enormously powerful. It's already enormously powerful, and it has the potential to be utterly transformational, not just to our economy, but to our society, and I think actually to our security. We're not talking about security today, but AI and its role in Britain's global security, I think, is something that the Labour Party ought to think about a lot. And when maybe a decade ago, a lot of people who were interested in AI and where it was going to go came together to decide how you deal with the threat and the danger, the risks that come from AI, they actually decided the best thing you could do, a lot of people, was to open source the technology. And so, like Kanishka, I'm not necessarily saying it's the only route, but I think Meta do deserve credit for open sourcing Llama, and I'm sure the models that will come after it. OpenAI, perhaps the market leader in this space, started out, as the name suggests, very open. As time has gone on, that has not quite how it's played out. So, credit to Meta for that. I think the debate on open source still remains open, no pun intended. But it is clearly something that we should all be very much aware of. A couple other points I wanted to make. We're at the stage with AI, we know machine learning works, right? We know deep neural networks work, deep learning works. It's actually now in many ways a question of scale. It's a question of chips and a question of energy. And there are enormous opportunities for economic growth when we think about that. We actually in the UK have a lot to shout about when it comes to this. We've got fantastic engineers, and particularly in London. But we've also got, I think, so what do you need for a big data centre? You need it to be cold, you need to have lots of energy. And Scotland, where I'm from, has both of those things. And so, there's been a real failure, I think, in Scotland to try and utilise the natural benefits that we have. But I kind of have the ambition, maybe it's a false hope, but I have the ambition that AGI will be trained in Scotland, at a data somewhere in Scotland. So I think there's a huge amount that we can do there. And then just finally on regulation, which has been touched on as well, and that's integral to economic growth. AI has to be regulated. We've got legislation that will come forward on that. My one note of caution is that in Europe, and particularly in the EU, they have often been very quick to regulate in a very strong way, and it has had a detrimental effect, I think, on the development of AI and the use of AI in the EU. And we are in a situation where the UK and the EU are eons behind the United States and China on a whole host of technology, and we just cannot afford to be the ones that miss out again. And so as an MP, as the AI bill comes forward and we think about regulation, I'm thinking about the safety, I'm thinking about the impact, the threat potentially to my constituents, but I'm also thinking about the opportunity that we can miss if we don't get that regulation right.
Thank you very much, and I think really important to remember that this is a global game, and we need to make sure that we're learning from our international partners, but also understanding where we can also make sure that we stay on the same level as well. And in fact, if I come back to you, Chris, about this actually, what role can government play in the UK specifically in improving uptake of these tools and improving the development of them in this country specifically?
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think. Gordon, you sort of pointed out the conundrum in the EU at the moment. So I think one of the things government could do is not give up the fairly constructive, positive place that the UK is in, where you permit a lot of this innovation to happen, within sensible guardrails, but not so far that you make it very, very difficult. Because, as you say, in the EU now, the new iPhones won't have the Apple Intelligence features. The new versions of our Llama models are not slated for release in the EU, which is down to the regulatory uncertainty for us, and everyone needs to know where they stand. So I think there's that part of it. I think there's big job for government to do about how do you bring this technology and the potential it has to improve people's lives into the public sector. Like a lot of the debates about public sector productivity, like technology has to be part of the answer. Is that not the whole answer? But certainly part of it, and that requires some vision in government. It requires probably some culture change in the way the public sector thinks about tech. We think the open source component of this is really important. We don't think that everything needs to be open source. There will be plenty of occasions where you want to use, for different reasons, a closed model. But there's also lots of things about government where the open source ethos really aligns well, right? This notion that actually you want to have control and understanding and transparency around the model. You want to make sure that the data that is used with it stays inside government, because if it's patient data or schools data, maybe you don't want to send that across the internet or into the cloud. You want to keep it somewhere where it's much more secure. And maybe you want to have a real eye on cost control and making sure that doesn't run away, which it can do in some setups. So I think there's a job for government to lead by example in here. And I think as well, for, like Kanishka was saying, and Ashley as well, like lots of the uptake by small businesses and others, like to some extent the large corporates will take care of themselves, right? But for the smaller companies, really knowing that this is available, that they can find it not necessarily by having to get a PhD computer scientist, but just that it's going to be in the products they use every day and it's going to make them more effective, I think will be important. So it's like, in my opinion, like all to play for. We just need to make sure that we get the rules set and that everything is pointing in the same direction for growth.
I couldn't agree more, and I think that's a really great challenge, actually, about government leading by example in public services. I think that's often a lever we don't talk about enough. So, yeah, thank you very much for raising it. Camilla, I'm going to come back to you, and again, same question. From your point of view, with some of the startups that you work with, what can government within the UK be doing to encourage take-up of these technologies and indeed the development of them? You mentioned Mistral earlier, for example. How do we compare with the French?
Yes, okay. I mean, there are lots of things that the government could do. For example, I think probably the most important thing is, yes, being clear on regulation. I actually do think that so far Labour has done a really, really good comms job on this, because so many startups are really, really worried about what the UK could have done because of what the EU, what an absolute car crash the EU has had. And so far, Labour's done a really, really good job at sort of saying, look, we wish to regulate a very, very small amount. We wish to do it in a very targeted way, and we don't wish to catch you up in a sort of massive net. So I think that's a really good job. I think one of the best things that they could do also, that again, Labour has already started, is the Regulatory Innovation Office. So if you're a tech nerd like me, or tech policy nerd like me, when you read about the Regulatory Innovation Office, you were going, well, hey. Right now, I think the idea that you would sort of look at regulators and say, hey, how can we improve things for innovators, is a really, really good idea, because for two reasons. One is, one of the issues with AI is that we're going to have such a massive long tail within all parts of the economy, it looks like. So my favorite example of this is Vet AI, which is essentially Babylon MD, but for like dogs. And at the moment, it goes to the veterinary regulator in this country, and the veterinary regulator is a sort of old industry regulator made up of old vets. They've never really had to deal with tech before. They've certainly never had to really deal with AI before, and they've just basically kept vet AI at sort of the side, kind of going, I don't know, guys, like we probably won't do much here. So if you've got someone in DCIT that can sort of sit there and ring them up and say, excuse me, what can we do to help you look at this? That's great. I think, but the other way that the RIO could be useful to startups is that we have, the big four regulators that, like the ICO and the CMA and Ofcom, who are quite used to dealing with startups. But I'll still complain about them because they still don't work fast enough, and their processes can still be very bureaucratic. And so anything that we can do to sort of constantly talk to regulators and say, what can we do to help you to make these processes work better for innovators, is, I think, a good idea. And the reason I think it's a good idea is because we're a top-tier market for startups to come and start, and indeed to scale up. There are so many things about our market that money cannot buy. It is so good. But there will always be a ceiling on our market, and one of those ceilings is we're small. And so in order to sort of be that market that we want to come to and sort of scale our products in, one of the ways we can do that is by saying, come here, we've got really good regulators who will work with you and get your products into the market in a safe way. So I think the Regulatory Innovation Office is key, but it needs teeth. Because one of the things I found talking to the team at the moment is that they're very knowledgeable, they're very enthusiastic, and I'm really happy to meet with them. But so far, it's more about, let's change the culture of regulators, and that's fine, that's useful. But it's also ephemeral. And what you want is this team to have a bit more teeth, I think, to just sort of get with regulators and say, oi, what are we doing here? So that would be really, really helpful.
I think that's a really great point, actually, that AI tech is not just regulated by AI tech regulators. There's a whole wide range of professional bodies, actually, they need engaging with, and I think that's something really important that you raise there.
And also, it will be hyper-specific. So I was on a panel yesterday where someone said, well, isn't AI regulators, quite expensive? Shouldn't we just have one regulator and then we can just fund that and they can do that? And that neglects the fact that the diffusion of AI is going to be so hyper-specific to certain sectors. And you really want to upskill and sort of fund those regulators who really understand their sector and who will really think, how is this going to affect the technology and the consumers that use this technology?
Yeah, I mean, in my former job, one of the things that we had to deal with was insurance regulators. They were really, the test for our tech to pass, for sure. Actually, I'd love to come to you and get your view on how government can reduce some of the barriers to adopting this technology. I'm particularly interested in your view on how we can support the skill sets that are required, how we can support upskilling the UK workforce as well.
Brilliant. I think one of the tragedies that we have that I see quite regularly, unfortunately, within the work that we do at Colour in Tech is there are a number of really enthusiastic young people who are leaving our education sector effectively and don't have the skills that a number of employers are looking for. And that is a tragedy in lots of ways because people spend a lot of money getting educated, the taxpayer's done a lot to get them to that point, and actually there's a load of great employers out there who really want to do more actually. And I think there are a couple of things on that. I think one, I think we do need a big we do need to close some of that feedback loop. So it's a bit similar to the regulatory point. How are we going to help our educational institutions actually understand the evolving demands that are going to happen as a result of the emerging technology? And, I think the sad thing is, I'm a school governor, I go into a school classroom and it looks pretty much the same as when I was in there. And I think we're not necessarily moving at the pace of the technology, and that is actually exacerbating some of the gaps we're seeing in terms of adoption and use cases, and that's especially across the country. To an extent, some of it happens by diffusion in London because you might be closer to employers, or you might be able to see some of that. But certainly outside of the capital, that's exacerbated. So I think there's one thing there. I think also how are government supporting SMEs to actually train and retrain and skill and support some of those people in the talent market. We're going to see a shift in labour, and I think part of that, and part of that's kind of inevitable. It happens with every wave of technology. That could be positive, it could be negative, but I think one thing where the opportunity lies is actually not only in the public sector and thinking about how we can use AI to support learning and training and the development across kind of sectors as an actual tool to help us on some of this stuff, but also thinking about things like the apprenticeship levy and what is government doing to actually think about further education and supporting people of working ages to reskill and retrain so that they can actually be driving forward some of the positive things that we want to be seeing this technology used for. Because the UK has actually got a really great talent mix, and I think when you speak to a lot of startups who are developing their businesses here, they love being in the UK because it gives them access to a lot of great things, and talent is certainly part of that. But we can't just sit on our laurels and just kind of expect that to be the case. We know that there's context around immigration and other things that are going on, and I think we need to be thinking about not just what we're doing today, but actually what does that future workforce in the next 10 years look like. And I think that's where it'd be really nice to see government again lead by example and actually also kind of make a really positive step in terms of setting a direction, an ambition, and a vision for the talent mix in the country. And I think that's partially what startups are considering, because sadly, as many people know, you will see a lot of startups, they'll kind of get to the Series A level of funding and then they'll think, well, I've got to go to the USA. And that's something we see a lot, and there's lots of reasons to that. Part of that is access to funding, part of it's also access to talent, and that cap comes too early really. If you think about that ceiling, it's hitting UK PLC too early. We're not getting the exits, we're not getting the growth funding, we're not seeing some of those things, and there are a few things that government can do to push that cap a little bit further up, and one of the key parts of that is on the talent mix as well.
Yeah, and I think that's a really important point about apprenticeships, actually, is the routes to these skill sets. I think apprenticeships and degree-level apprenticeships will play a huge role in that. So, yeah, a really good point, well made. Gordon, one for you. I'm going to flip the question, actually, and say, what can the SME community and industry do to help government make the right decisions?
That's a difficult question, actually. I'm going to have to think about that. Is it easier to...
I don't know.
Those can hear me, or maybe that's much easier. There we go. Thank you very much. That's a difficult question, and I'm going to stall by giving you an answer to some of the points and then come back to it. Just on your point about capital, it's so important. I mean, any company that's at the UK that's looking for a Series A, Series B investment, they end up on the east or the west coast of the United States, and that is not good for our economy. And actually, if you look at, I was reading a paper on this last week, if you look at pension funds in the UK, and what percent of pension funds are allocated to venture capital funding, it is a fraction of what pension funds in the United States allocate to venture capital funding. So I think there is a job of work for the government to engage with pension funds and encourage them to put that into venture capital funding, which is essentially what has driven so much of the technology revolution over the last couple of decades. I did an event earlier this afternoon also about AI, but specifically looking at AI in public services, which is what's just been touched on. And there were a couple of interesting things that I came away from it. I mean, the first is that there is a large coalition of people who are very sceptical of AI in public services, and I think it's on us as policymakers to try and deal with that lack of trust that exists. Not just as policymakers, also companies like Meta and others, to demonstrate to people what AI can do for public service, what AI can do and why people should trust it. But there are so many things that we can do even now, never mind into the future. So an example that comes to mind, put aside the privacy questions for now, because it's just an example. But if you think of the average work of a GP, it's a big issue facing everyone, trying to get a GP appointment is very hard. But they spend quite a lot of their time actually not speaking to patients but filling in forms, partly because the NHS and the service has been cut so badly over the last 14 years. If you can just automate that, if you can have AI helping with the form filling, that is going to save, say you save even 10 seconds, and you would hopefully save more. If you save 10 seconds per GP appointment, there are 30 million GP appointments every month in England. That would have a transformational impact on the NHS backlog. We're not just going to resolve the backlog through AI, don't get me wrong, but it can play an important role. And then also just on public services, part of the issue that you have is that the senior leadership, both actually politicians historically and also at a civil service level, what percent of senior civil servants come from a computer science or technical background? Don't know the answer to that, but I suspect the answer is very, very low. And so you're never going to be able to properly get technology into any organisation, never mind the government, when the senior figures in it are not as well versed as they should be. How SMEs can help the government, I think it's partly through adoption of the technology themselves, and ultimately in our society there is nothing that is more effective than explaining to businesses, articulating to businesses it's in their self-interest. It's going to help them free up human capital. Ultimately, that's what this technology, I think, in the long term can help achieve. People are spending, hopefully, will spend less time doing manual data entry kind of level of jobs, and instead, it frees up time in the company, it frees up resource, it frees up efficiency. And I think the more that businesses adopt that technology, and businesses generally are always better at adopting technology than governments, then people like us, MPs and others in government, can look to SMEs that are doing the job very well and learn from them rather than the other way around.
Yeah, very fair point, very fair point. I think we've got time now for some questions. I don't know if you're able to hold the microphone. So I think the gentleman in the green jacket had his hand up very quickly, so please go ahead.
I will try and be fast, sorry. My name is Rob Scott. I wear several hats to this conversation. I'm a Labour Party member, that's the capacity I'm here in, but I also work for BBC Research and Development, so obviously we're very interested in AI. And one of the things I'm big into, I'm on the bandwagon of immersive tech. I'm wearing the Ray-Bans now.
Excellent.
But the question, and this is where the public service hat comes in, is we're going to be opening up people's eyeballs to a lot more stuff. The goal is to put visual stuff in people's field of view. At the moment, the economy on our smartphones is controlled by push notifications. That's going to change, and it's going to go behind an AI that decides what to show me in my field of view, which takes away some agency. So I'm kind of interested in the conversation that you as MPs, but also you, Chris, think about in Meta. Like, what is the conversation that needs to happen, both from a public service viewpoint, but also from an SME viewpoint? If my watch is telling me I'm hungry, and my AI says, oh, there's a burger deal over there, it's going to send me over there. And that's maybe okay, like, I'm kind of okay with that, but I think there needs to be some real thought about that reduction in agency that is going to happen. So what's my question? I'm a bit scared by it. I think there's something weird going on that could go on there, and how do we have the right conversation so that this future that we get to isn't like hyper-reality and ads everywhere? How is it useful and helpful and actually increases people's agency, if that makes sense?
Is anybody particularly wants to jump in on that one? If not,
or you can wait till after.
Yeah.
I'll be happy.
Yeah. Shall I give you
Chris, if that's all right.
Yeah, so like, quick perspective on this, and I think it's come up here and it's come up in other sessions as well. Like, in the end, technology exists to serve people, not the other way around. I think, yes, you've got to be cognizant of the fact that our relationship with technology is always evolving. I also think, like, if this is done well and responsibly, it should give people a lot more control and agency over their lives. I think a lot of people will benefit from having, I don't know quite exactly what it will look like, but this notion that all of us should have access to more tools that help us get things done and help us be productive in our lives and in our relationships in a way that at the moment only a few people with a lot of wealth and power have access to. I think that's tremendously powerful and democratizing. I actually think one thing that comes up a lot when I observe this conversation is I actually think we need better storytellers. For like a lot of the way that we think about technology is framed through this lens of science fiction and dystopia, and maybe there are reasons why the people writing the fiction gravitate in that direction, and it's true not just for science fiction but lots of other types. But like, we need some more positive stories about technology out there in the world as well. But it's on all of us, like, not just the tech companies building it, but for government and politicians to be engaged in the conversation, for civil society to be involved in the debate as well. But look, the future is what we make of it. It's not sort of set in stone.
Yeah, that's a very good point. Camilla, I don't know if you wanted to just jump in quickly.
I was only going to say I look forward to seeing you afterwards, because I'd love to chat about this. I did my my MA, my philosophy MA in the ethics of transhumanism. So the bit before we all become cyborgs, I was very, very interested in that. Chris said it far more eloquently than me, and I won't repeat it. But yes, suffice to say, I was going to say something very similar, and then I was only going to say that in the same way that AI is not one technology, we didn't have like a car act that just sort of regulated everything to do with the car in one fell swoop. And I think this will have to be iterative, and I don't think we're quite there yet, but we'll get there soon. And I think that's, like, we've shown that we can iterate.
Yeah, very good point, very good point. Lady at the front here, if that's all right, please.
Hi everyone, my name is Oyen. I'm the founder of a company called Neo Group. I have a question around skills. There seems to be a gap between upskilling as well as upskilling people at a basic digital skills level versus upskilling people to build AI tools. What's the government doing in order to close that digital skills gap? The reason why I ask is because I run a bootcamp provider business where we upskill women to get into tech, specifically women from Black and ethnic minority backgrounds. But what we find is that we want to upskill people in AI, but they don't have the basic digital skills in order for them to be able to build AI technologies.
No, I think it's a really good question, Gordon, as far as you're able.
It's a very good question. I mean, the answer is thank you very much.
6 weeks into the government is not something we've resolved yet, but it's something I hope we do. And I suppose ultimately the long-term answer is education at the school level, right? I'm a Scottish MP, I represent a Scottish constituency, education has devolved. But I can tell you, I don't know if this is true in England, but it is in Scotland, the number of computing teachers in Scottish schools has declined over the last 5 years, which I just find astounding. I mean, this is literally, the most important skills that you can teach young people to prepare them for the labour market in the next couple of decades, and the number of teachers are declining. There's also separately a long-running problem, I think, in technical education in schools that people who go and study computer science can earn a lot more money working as engineers or founding companies than going to be teachers. So it's a question not just for Peter Kyle as DSET Secretary, but it's a question for Bridget Phillipson as Education Secretary. You make a very good point, and it's something that I hope to use my position in Parliament to try and advance.
Very good. Chris?
Can I just add one thing to this, which is one of the places where open source comes in is that it helps you break this constraint on number of teachers or the system, because the Llama models have been downloaded tens, if not hundreds of millions of times, and there are people all around the world building with them and sharing their knowledge. So yes, you need the teachers and the universities and all the skills building out there, but you need curious people who can look online and find communities and get all of that insight and start to build with it. And that's really, really powerful and something that the internet makes possible that wasn't possible before.
Yeah, very good, very, very true. Thank you very much. I think we've got time for one more question. I think the gentleman here, I think you had your hand up earlier.
Hey, thank you. I'm Seven. I actually work with Ashley at Colour and Tech. I work with our startup community, so a lot of what's been said is really interesting. Particularly, I want to pick up on the venture funding element that was kind of discussed over here. This might be a little bit of an impossible question, but I think it's really interesting anyway, so I'm going to try to ask it in a helpful way. So a little citation needed, I read a couple of years ago, US pension funds put more into our venture capital market than our own, I think, family offices do, something like that, because we are a less risky market compared to the US market. But startups are the game of risk. The startup ecosystem is the game of risk, and that's the point. And I've probably worked with hundreds of founders now all across Europe in the work that we do, who all give me the same story over and over again, not just in the UK, but in markets across the EU. We have to go to the US because over here investors just don't get us. And a lot of investors are too risk averse to really be working in what is meant to be a game of risk. And that doesn't feel, I'm hoping, and this is kind of my question to you, is what can policy do about that? Because I wonder if it's more of a cultural challenge than it is anything else. And culture is something that is not easy to affect in any way quickly. Culture is slow, and it is very personal to people, and it is, you know what I mean? It's developed over a long time. So what can we do about this loss to the US of startups?
Yeah, really good point. Ashley, I wonder if you've got anything to add to that.
Well, I think we've got to make sure that the UK is as attractive of a place as it can be. That's obviously, but I think part of that does relate down to money. If I think some of the stuff that the Labour Party has spoken about, in particular, like the British Business Bank, like that plays as an LP. We've heard some stuff about pension funds. Like, how many funds are there that are offering real growth capital to unconventional ideas, and what can we do to unlock more of that funding? And actually, what can we do to be transparent about where that funding is also going? Too little of those funds are going to black women, for example. Too little of those funds are going outside of London. Like, we need to be thinking about equity in what we're doing as well, and how we can make sure that actually where these unconventional ideas do exist, that they also get the support, so that they either don't stop or they have to go and find that where people have a different risk-taking appetite. I know Camilla has some
Sorry. That's really, really interesting. So quickly on risk. I don't know if this is true or not. I don't actually think we are less risky, but I would tell you where I think the perception comes from, because a lot of American investors will say it's just much harder for British startups to sort of scale and compete, and therefore if they've made it, then they're sort of seen almost as slightly more hardy. So I think that's where that perception sometimes comes from. In terms of culture, yes, we have a very, very young VC ecosystem. So our VC ecosystem is really only about 10 years old. We have made astonishing strides in that time, but I would agree. I think a lot of our VC in this country is family offices, and they tend to trust a very to feel comfortable with a very narrow sense of like what a founder should look like. So yes, I do think, and indeed, what a good startup is. So that is an issue, but it is changing, and it's changing rapidly. And if I could say one thing that government can do to help that, I think, is just help flood the market with different investors and new kinds of investors. One of the ways that we can do this is through the enterprise management scheme, which essentially helps startups attract people into startups by offering them equity instead of the high salaries that, say, Meta can give you when you come work for them. And when your startup exits, then you often find that you've created a whole load of millionaires who then want to invest angel-wise in the startup ecosystem. We've done it a lot of times. We can do it more. It needs a slight reform. And then, get more American investors in, which we are getting lots of American investors who are setting up European offices in this country. So I'm optimistic because I think it's changing, but it's been a definite historical issue, definitely.
I think it's also important to add that when a startup's looking for a VC investor, yes, the cash is obviously the prime mover of that. But as a startup, you want to speak to VCs that've got also expertise that they can bring to the table as well, a board member that'll be able to have input to the business as well. And that just means that the US will have VCs that have been there, done that, and it does continue to make them more attractive. But yeah,
well, it's also names, right? You want to get the right name, and that's quite a difficult thing to break. So yeah.
Yes, agreed. Hopefully, as we build that up, it'll become easier. I'm afraid I think that's all that we have time for. So I just want to say quickly thank you very much to our wonderful panellists for joining us, to SME4Labour for arranging this, for Meta for hosting, and of course, finally, all of you guys for coming along and listening and contributing as well. So thank you very much, and I hope you enjoyed it.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Yeah.
Great to touch base at another point.